In this lesson, you'll learn the Lumos framework for Webflow. A framework is like a style guide you start your project from that includes classes, components, and variables to speed up your workflow. Lumos is a component-first framework geared towards enterprise builds. It's born out of my experience working on massive six-figure enterprise sites, so I know what it takes to make a website truly scalable. But even for simple landing pages, I always start from Lumos because it includes so many components that speeds up the workflow while ensuring the site can be fast, accessible, and scalable. So let's get started learning Lumos. First, go to the docs. This has all of the details on the framework. We'll start by grabbing the Webflow clonable. Each project we create should start from a fresh clone, even if the version number hasn't changed. There's often smaller updates to things like slider or tab components, so it's best to grab the latest. Once in the project, we can open apps and search for and install the Fluid Builder app. This is how we update our Fluid font sizes and spacings. We'll also install SVG import, which is how we add SVGs to the page. Next, let's grab the Lumos Chrome extension. This extension provides class naming suggestions and keyboard shortcuts that really speed up the workflow, so you'll want to add that before you start. If you're designing, you can grab the Lumos Figma file. If your design wasn't created with this file, it's totally fine, but this has helpful things like turning on the text trim by default, so the spacing matches the actual spacing we'll see in Webflow, things like all of our different button components and their hover states within each of the themes, and our different section spacings. So again, if your design has many more components, many more spacing variables, we can always add those in Webflow. This is just a helpful starting point. And on the components page in Figma, we have some example sections that we can start our design from. Now, if we hop into Webflow, let's open the variables panel. These are all the core styles used throughout the site. In the default collection, we might have our max width, our border radius, border width, our different colors. Inside of the typography collection, we can have font family, weights, letter spacing, and line height. We can always apply these styles directly, but if we head over to the style guide page, this has classes we can use attached to those different variables. So we have classes for our H1, we have classes for our weights, our line heights, our letter spacings. So we can use these classes to speed up our workflow. Now, if we open up our components panel, here we have our different groupings of components. Things like our different button components, our card components, our form component, and all of the elements used to create a form. Our global components like nav, footer, global styles, and interactive components like accordions, modals, sliders, and tabs. These are JavaScript-based components. Then our layout components like a button wrapper to hold our buttons, content wrappers to hold headings and paragraphs, grids, divs, and sections. Then we have miscellaneous components. These are components that go inside of a parent but shouldn't be used directly, like a menu that goes inside of the nav component. A banner also goes inside of that nav component. Then we have SVG components. These are like our icons and logos. We have our typography elements, and we have anything related to utilities like our clickable component, our spacers, and our code, and then our visual components like overlay, image, and video. So these are the core categories we can create new components in. And if we head over to our pages, we have this standard page template. We can create new pages from this because it has all the elements we need to build out a page. Starting with the page wrap, which holds all of the content on the page, so we can easily copy an entire content of a page from one page to the next. This page wrap is set to overflow clip to prevent any horizontal scroll without disabling position sticky. Now inside that we have our global styles. This is CSS that goes on every page of the site. Within that we have the Lumos default CSS, and we can also add our own embed to store project-specific styles if we'd like. Now we also have our global guides. This is just a position fixed div with a couple guides, so we can check how elements are aligning with each other across multiple sections, and these guides automatically hide whenever we preview or publish. Under that we have our nav. Under that we have our page main, which is set to a tag and ID of main, so that screen reader users can skip past tabbing all the nav links and go directly to the main content. So this should hold all of the sections on our page, and it's a page slot here so that the client can use build mode. Without a page slot, the client can't delete any elements or drag them around, but anything inside the page slot allows the client to delete and add elements. So we want to use that to enable build mode. And underneath the page main goes our footer element. And if your footer or nav design are completely different, you can delete the elements and create your own design. These are just helpful starting components so you don't have to manually add the nav and footer to all the pages like password and 404. They're already on those pages. Now the page wrap here has a min height of 100 SVH, so it's always at least as tall as the screen height, and it has this flex vertical. And what that allows us to do is set the page main to grow if possible, so it fills all the remaining space. Without that, the footer would be floating up towards the top of the screen, but this helps keep the footer anchored down. And the page main is also set to a flex vertical so that if we have a page with only one section and we want the section to fill the remaining space without pushing the footer out of view, we can just give that section a flex grow and it'll fill all the remaining space of the page main. A component-first mindset enables clients and non-technical teammates to easily create new pages from existing components. If we check out the example component page, we have some example layouts we can copy over to create a new page. On any of these, we can change the theme, and it affects all children inside as well. We can change the spacing. We can also select individual elements and change their style. We can add or remove elements, and we can create new forms entirely, new slider or tab or modal components from these basic building blocks. The goal is to empower non-technical teammates to do as much as possible to make the site truly scalable, and it speeds up the process for developers as well. So developers can create new sections from those same building blocks. We can drop in a section component. I'll switch its theme. Let's switch it to page top since it's at the top of the page. And on the section and container, we can add unique classes to customize this even further. Within that container, we might add a grid component. I'm hitting my down arrow key. And then I might go ahead and add a content wrapper, which holds headings, buttons, and paragraphs. Within that content wrapper, I'll add a heading component, and let's also add a paragraph component, and we'll add a button wrapper. And within that button wrapper, let's add our main button. We'll duplicate it and switch the next one to our second style. So on this content wrapper here, we can change the alignment variant, and that changes not only text alignment, but also the flex alignment of any children to keep everything in sync. And within this grid, we might also add an image element, and we might give that image a height full class, so it's a height 100%. And now we have this completely responsive section built out. Now we might also want to add a modal component here for some interaction. And within this modal, I'll go ahead and show in Designer. We have variants for a lot of components to change its style, small and full screen in this case. And within that modal slot, I'll go ahead and paste in my form element, and I'll go ahead and change this name to be my quote form. And I'll go ahead and give this modal an ID of quote so I can link to it. And then on this modal, we can rename this and just add a quick label. So I'll call this my quote modal. So I have a clear label in the navigator, and I'll call this my hero section. And so I'll go ahead and hide this. On this button here, I want it to open that modal. So I'll say get a quote, and then I can connect this with data attributes. All of this is in the Lumos Docs, but I'll say data modal trigger. And I want this to trigger the quote modal that we created. And so now if I go ahead and enable custom code down here, when I click that button, it's going to show the modal, and we have that functionality built out with the basic building blocks that we have here. And we can continue to take this as far as we want. So I might add in a quick tab component, and within that, I might have a tab link. Notice how the slot is named based off the child I want to add here. So in this case, tab link, and I'll duplicate that a few times, and I'll switch this to tab link 2 and tab link 3. And then I can just copy this grid, and I'll paste 3 of them within my tab content here. And what we'll want to do is be able to see all of them. So on the tab, let's go ahead and preview the content. And that way we can see them all here, and I can switch this out. And so now we have this functional tab component built into our site as well. And again, we were able to create all that from our basic building blocks of these components. Now, when the function or content of a component is different, we create separate components. So at first glance, it looks like these arrows and this pause button could be the same component since they share the same style. But if we check them out, they're actually built as 2 separate components. The arrow button component has a variant for arrow direction, which we wouldn't want showing up on the play button, and it has some default text that makes sense for that component. Whereas the play button has different default text and it has a pause icon inside we wouldn't want to load into these other components. So when the functionality and content is different, we create separate components. When only the style is different, that's when we create variants. So if we wanted a version where these tab links stack under each other and they're on side of the tab content, then we would just go ahead and create a component variant and select any children and change their style based on that variant. Now, so far we've created open components, meaning all of the content is inside these component slots where we can freely add and remove elements. So if we were to include this quote modal on every page of our site, and then we decide to add a new form element, this change would only be added to this one page. It wouldn't be added across every page that used the quote modal. So to turn this modal into a closed component, we move it outside of the page slot, right click on it, and wrap it in a div. Then we turn that parent div into a closed component. I'll call this my quote modal, put it in my interactive group, and create. And so now if I add or remove elements inside of this child here, because it's inside of this closed component, everywhere we include this closed component will be updated. Now let's go ahead and rename this section to be our CTA section. And let's say we have multiple of these across different pages of our site. And we decide we want to make a design change, like maybe reducing the font size, increasing the bottom margin. That change has only been made to this one instance. We would have to go back to every page that used a CTA component and change these styles like so. So if we wanted to turn this component into a closed component for that consistency, we would move it up, go ahead and wrap it in a div, and I would go ahead and turn this into a component called section CTA. We start with section so we can search for all our different sections, and we put it in the section group and create. So now everything is locked into this component. Anything I change, whether it's the text, the style, will be changed across every instance. So maybe we want the CTA heading to be the same on every page where we use this component. But if we don't, then we can actually link the text up to a component prop. So on this heading here, on its text, I create a prop, and I'll put this in a group called heading and create that group. And then maybe we want to be able to hide and show the paragraph. So we would connect its visibility. I'd put that in a group called paragraph and create that group, and then also be able to change the paragraph text. Let's create a text prop, and we'll put that in our paragraph group and create. So now if we change something like maybe the font size on this paragraph, that's going to be updated across every instance of the component since we didn't connect that to a prop. But if we change something like the text in here, that's only going to be updated across this one instance of the component since this is connected to the prop. And because this is a rich text, we're able to bold certain words inside, which we couldn't do if we were just using plain text. We're able to make certain words a link and even change the tag since this is the first one on the page. So we have all those controls there. Now, what if we want to be able to add and remove cards to this list? Right now, we can only have 3 cards in here. So what we can do is we can open this section here, and we'll notice that we have our grid here, and within the grid are each of our cards. Now, this grid is a slot, but it's not a slot for the entire component we have here. So what we would need to do is drop in a component slot, and when we do that, we now have access to the slot on the entire section CTA component. Now, if I were to drop a card in here, notice how no matter how many I add, they're all just inside of one column. They're inside of a div, which is inside of the grid. What we want to do instead is make it look like these cards are inside the main grid. So we would give our slot a class of UDisplayContents, and that makes it look like anything we drop in here is a direct child of the grid itself. It ignores this middle div. And so now if we have multiple cards, notice how they're stacking within our grid. And that way we can choose to maybe have 3 cards in one instance. Maybe in the other component, we want like 5 cards. So we can make this section a lot more flexible. And here we're able to use this closed component, which holds our styles together with a little bit of open flexibility. And then also we want to mark on the name of the slot, what card we want the client to drop into this. So I would just double click on this and call it card primary. And that way the client knows exactly which component to drop into the slot. And now we have this closed stylable section CTA component. Now, sometimes we'll want to build a custom section without a component. So we'll start with a section element. We'll give it a class of U-section. U stands for utility, so it's a reusable class throughout our site. It's set to vertical flex by default and align center so that if we give the section a min height, the container will be centered inside. It's also set to position relative, so if we have any absolute background image or video inside, it'll be contained within the section. And then it has a default background color and text color of our theme background and text. Now we can override any of that with other utilities. So I can override the background color with a utility. We can override the position back to static with a utility, or the flex alignment, or anything we'd like. And inside that section, let's add a spacer, and let's go ahead and duplicate that spacer. And this allows us to adjust the top and bottom spacing within that section. And then in between those, let's add a div with the class of u-container. And for this container here, it's set to margin auto to center it. And then it has a width of 100% minus the site margin times 2. So it's leaving a little space on each side. And then it has a max width of 90 rem in this case. We can change that, but we could change that over to small, or we could make it full if we wanted to go all the way to the edge always. And we also have on the container a container type inline size that helps with that responsiveness. Now we have different versions of the container, like we can add a uContainer full if we want the element to go full width minus that site margin, or we can add uContainer small if we want to make the container a bit smaller there and it has a tighter max width. And we can also override the max width with other max width utilities. Like if I go 30ch, it tightens up that max width there. So that's it for our container. Now, whenever we're giving these sections classes, we usually want to start with a custom class first. So I might call this something like my hero compact, if this is going to be a smaller hero, and this will be underscore wrap, which marks the start of the component. And then on top of that, I would add the U section class. So this allows us to apply overrides that won't affect every section. They just affect this one hero compact. So if we go to that base class, we can do things like set a minimum height of 100 SVH. And that way we've applied that here while still inheriting the rest of the U section defaults. Now, if we make any kind of override on this custom class, it's going to override the utility. So now the style isn't coming from the utility, it's coming from the custom class. And with the Lumos Chrome extension, if we hold the Shift key and press up arrow, it takes us to that base class. And if we hold Shift key and down arrow, it takes us back to all classes. Now on this container, we want to still use our custom class. So with the Lumos Chrome extension, if I hit my right arrow key, it pulls the class name from the parent, and then I can call this underscore contain. And that way, if I search container, it doesn't show any custom classes. It's just showing the utility. And now I can stack that on top. And if I head to this base class, I might make this not stretch out in height. And this override that I've applied here just is affecting this one instance. Even if we were to make a change here, like maybe making the container smaller, that's not affecting every instance of uContainer. That's just affecting the uContainer that was stacked on top of this custom class. So it makes it safe to make overrides here, even though it's best to apply them to the base class. If we do accidentally make a change here, it's not going to affect other uContainers site-wide. And then within that, we can choose at any point to switch to using like our building blocks again. So things like the grid or things like the content wrapper. But if we do want our own custom classes for that, we would just add divs and call this our compact layout. And then within that, a div for our compact content. And we can use static divs for these types of things instead of components if we want. Now, if we were to turn this into a component, like I'll call this section hero compact, and I'll go ahead and put that in a section folder. What we'll notice is we would need to connect the variants for the padding top and padding bottom, and we would need to set up variants for all of our different themes, and that can be a very manual process. So what I prefer to do instead is just duplicate this section custom component. That's the whole point of this component, is in the variable or in the component panel, we duplicate it here, and then I can give it a custom name, like I'll call this section CTA and create. And now when I add this section CTA onto the page, it already has all of these different variants built in, and I can just delete the ones I don't need. So if I don't need an eyebrow in the CTA, I just delete that. And then I select the whole section, head over to props, and then I just delete the unneeded props, like the props for this eyebrow. And that's much faster than recreating all these different props from scratch. Now, if we open this component, we'll notice that it has a custom class called section wrap. And if we take a look at that, that custom class is applying the different themes to each variant. So on the dark variant, we switched it over to the dark theme. And on the brand variant, we switched it to brand theme. These variants are saved within the custom class. So that we don't lose this, what we want to do is just duplicate that custom class, and we'll just call it CTA wrap. This is the start of our CTA section. And then for the container here, we'll duplicate, call it CTA contain. And for the layout here, again, duplicate, call it CTA layout. And this way we're able to keep those custom classes and just really speed up our workflow for creating unique sections. One more advantage to closed components is that the content is saved on the section component itself, not on the individual elements. So if we want to switch this secondary button over to a text link site-wide, we can just go ahead and add in our button text link component, and then we can start connecting its text to the button to text, its link to the button to link, and any other attributes connected. Then we can just go ahead and delete that original button to. Let's connect visibility to button to visibility as well. And so now we didn't have to manually re-upload the text and the link across all the pages where this section was used. We just swapped the content from one child component to another. For each text element, there's some default bottom margin. This creates consistency and speeds up our workflow. So when I drop in an H2 heading, I don't have to guess what kind of bottom space looks good with this. The spacing is automatic. Now, if we head to variables and under text style, we'll notice we have a single margin top and margin bottom variable, and it's being updated for each heading level. So on an H2, it's a bit larger here. Margin top is mainly just used inside of blog post long form content, but margin bottom is used quite a lot. So if I change this bottom margin on the H2, that's going to update across all H2s site-wide, so it makes that space much larger here. Now, we can, of course, always override that by doing a different custom value for that margin bottom on this one instance, but by default, it inherits that default bottom margin. And if I were to switch this to a different heading size, notice how the bottom margin is changing based on the heading level that I'm using. So that space is automatic. Same for the paragraph. It has some default bottom margin that can change based on the paragraph's size there. And that just separates it from other paragraphs or different elements we might have. Now, this button group has its own top margin, and margins by default overlap, so we're not going to have the bottom margin when the paragraph combines with the top margin of the button group. They'll just overlap each other. So this button wrapper here has some default top margin. I can go ahead and change that, and it'll affect all button groups site-wide. So if we later decide we want to space all the buttons further or closer to the content, we can make that change. We can also edit the default gap. And these are just the defaults. So just like the text elements, we can change the margin top per instance. We can override that to make it tighter. We can change the gap per instance, override that. But if we don't, we'll have these defaults, and that's just important for speed and consistency. Now, what we'll notice is on this unique button wrapper, I've added this bottom margin just to separate it from the image here. Now, what happens if I hide that image is we actually don't get that bottom margin anymore, and that's because the content wrapper has this U margin trim. It removes the bottom margin from the last visible child and the top margin from the first visible child. So if I were to take that off, all of a sudden we have this extra space that we don't actually want here. So it's important to have that margin trim on. It's on the content wrapper by default, and it's also on the container, so we can add text directly inside our container, but we can also add that class manually to any element we'd like. Now, notice when I take this image here and I were to give it maybe like a cover absolute, so it's absolute and it fills the background, all of a sudden that margin is also still clipped, and we would expect it to not be clipped. But the reason is whenever an element has this class of cover absolute, the margin trim ignores it, and it no longer treats this image as the last child. It's now treating the button wrap as still being the last child. So that's super helpful here. Now, if we want an element to still be ignored even without the cover absolute, we can just give it a trim ignore class. And when we add that ignored trim, it'll just ignore this element. It won't treat it as the last child. And this next element up will get the margin trimmed off of it. So cases where that's useful is on these spacer divs, for instance, I have that trim ignore class on by default. And that way it no longer trims the margin from these spacer divs as first and last children. It'll actually trim it off all of the other elements instead. Now, one thing we'll notice here is we can give this paragraph a max width. I'll give it a max width of something like 50 ch, and that's working well there, except for when we set our alignment to center. The text align is center, but it's no longer center aligning this element. Now, if we want to center align an element, we can always go with a flex, and we can go with a vertical flex to make elements stack under each other, and that'll make it respect the alignment again. But the problem is, notice how our margins changed, because whenever a parent is set to flex, margins no longer overlap each other. So this space gets a little bit larger. So instead of setting a parent element to flex, we just want to set the individual child to flex. In this case, the text elements. Whenever we set a max width on a text element, we want to add uChildContain, and that'll move this max width off of the parent and onto the child. And it'll also apply flex to this parent so that the parent now respects our alignment here without messing up any of our margins or our gaps between elements. So if we take a look at that uChildContain, we'll notice that that class here is set to a vertical flex, but its left and right alignment is connected to our alignment mode. So that way it respects the parent's alignment. And if we head over to our variables here, we have this alignment mode here, which is start, center, end. We plug this into our text alignment and our flex alignment to keep everything in sync from that alignment switch. So that allows us to, this class allows us to just have the alignment completely connected with these max width elements. I could do the same thing on the heading, maybe create a tighter max width here. And then I want to add that uChildContain so that it moves the max width into the child. And now when I set the alignment here, it keeps all of that in sync with that uChildContain. Also, instead of setting alignment from the variable dropdown, we can always add an alignment utility on any element. So if I set alignment center, for instance, it'll center everything the same way a dropdown would, just in case we want to apply that to an actual section element or something that doesn't have the actual dropdown on it. Most Webflow sites look broken when the user increases their font size. For a site to be accessible, the user should be able to double their font size, so 32 pixels, without any content overflowing. But because Webflow breakpoints are set with pixels, it never switches us to the next breakpoint. It just stays on desktop indefinitely, and all the content overflows. The pixel breakpoints is an outdated standard. Lumos uses a breakpointless approach of auto-fit grids and container queries to make sure that the layout wraps just like it would respond to browser zoom, so no content overflows. This gives us more control over exactly where the layout should wrap instead of having to wait for the tablet breakpoint. It makes responsiveness faster since our responsiveness is automatic, gives us more control, and makes the site more accessible for users. Now, the first tool we have is accessible fluid font sizes. Without fluid font sizes, here I have this heading just reducing on each breakpoint like we normally would. And what we'll notice on the published site is that whenever we zoom, the heading will eventually get smaller from an increased zoom because we crossed into a breakpoint. Eventually it gets smaller again each time we cross into a breakpoint. But this allows us to make our paragraph 5 times its original size without the heading ever overflowing. Whereas in Webflow, if we just double the size, the heading's already overflowing, and that's because we never cross into the next breakpoint, so this heading just keeps getting larger indefinitely. And same with the padding here on our container, instead of it reducing like it would on that next breakpoint, it just keeps growing indefinitely. This is where we can use fluid sizes instead, because fluid sizes will bypass the breakpoints. So if we open our fluid builder, here we can select any variables we want to make fluid, like this H2 font size. I'll make it be 5rem, which is 80 pixels on desktop, and 2rem, which is 32 pixels on mobile. And the screen size is set here. So it's going to be 5rem at a 1440 screen size. It'll shrink down to 2rem at a 320 pixel screen size. And if I add in my container padding here, I can make that 3rem on desktop, 1rem on mobile between those two screen sizes. Now notice we get this accessibility error because the difference between our max and min size is too large. And this is saying we won't be able to double the size when reaching max browser zoom. And we can ignore that error for any spacing related things. We only want to worry about that with font sizes. We want to make sure that the difference isn't too extreme. And even if we were using breakpoint sizes, if the size was 5rem on desktop and 1rem on mobile, we'd run into the same issue where we wouldn't be able to double the size at max browser zoom. So this is just a great thing to keep in mind across the board. But now we can actually just apply those fluid sizes here. So I'll apply that to my font size, and I'll apply that to my left and right padding here on this container. And what we'll notice is now we'll actually have the responsiveness working the exact same way it would work with browser zoom. So when we reach that large size, the heading still isn't overflowing. And this even works smoother than browser zoom because when we zoom, it won't shrink down like it would normally when crossing between breakpoints. It's going to smoothly increase all the way up. So by default in Lumos, all of our different font sizes are completely fluid, and all of our different spacings and section spacings are fluid as well. So we can just open the Fluid Builder to edit any of those, and we can see the results in real time. So if I start changing this H2's desktop font size, notice we're seeing that update right here on the page, and we can preview how it's going to work. And then for our max and min screen size, those are connected to variables in Lumos as well. So we have that set right here, maximum screen size of 90 rem, min of 20 rem, and that just controls where the fluid sizes start scaling up and down. So if I were to edit this here, it'll also update in the variable panel. So this is increasing my container's max width based on that screen size there. And I can also edit it within the variables as well. The site margin, this is the left and right space. So this keeps our content from touching the edge of the screen. We can start increasing this, and this is completely fluid. So it could start really large and then it could shrink down to being really small here on mobile. So we can dial in both the desktop and mobile value for that site margin. Anything that would normally be set with pixels like border radius, border width, drop shadows, we want to set that all with rem instead. Normally when the user zooms their browser, we'll notice even if I set this border width and radius with pixels, it's going to keep increasing in size all the way up. But if the user increases their font size, the border width and border radius doesn't keep increasing like it would with browser zoom. So this border radius feels a lot smaller, and same with the border width. But if we make sure that instead of using pixels, we're using rem for any of these different values, so things like our border radius, we can edit that and switch that over to the rem equivalent. Things like our border width, we make sure that this is set in rem like it normally is in Lumos by default. And by doing that, that keeps the border width, border radius, and any other pixel values working just like browser zoom, where it's going to increase in size with the rest of the content. So we want to avoid applying styles on lower breakpoints. Instead of going to tablet and making these elements stack under each other, on desktop we just want to allow wrapping when we run out of space. So we're letting the browser decide when to wrap these elements, and this is better because if we add extra links, it'll just automatically wrap before we run out of space. If the user translates to a different language that's maybe a bit longer, it's still just going to figure out when these elements should wrap for us without us having to set that manually. Another tool we have for improved responsiveness is an auto-fit grid. So if we drop in a grid component here, this is automatically an auto-fit grid. So if we have 2 cards, it becomes a 2-column grid, 3 cards, it becomes a 3-column grid, and this is just automatically responsive. Now on the grid, we set the minimum width for our columns, in this case 18 rem, and it's just going to wrap before those columns get smaller than 18 rem. Now, if we want these cards to be able to get even smaller, we can reduce this minimum column width to something like 10 rem, and now they'll get even more condensed here before they eventually wrap somewhere down here. And again, they stay condensed, and then they'll wrap somewhere there. So what it's going to do is try and fit as many cards in here as it can, while ensuring that the minimum width of these cards is never smaller than 10 rem. Now, what we can do is set a maximum column count on this. So we're basically saying that even though these have a small minimum width, never let us have more than 2 cards per column, and then they'll still wrap before this minimum column size gets really small there. Now, one thing we'll notice here is because this is an auto fit, it's just going to stretch these cards out and make them fit the entire grid. But what we might want to do instead is we can switch this over to autofill. And when we do that, it'll just fill in the grid with some empty spaces here. So usually if we have a collection that we're filtering, we want to use autofill. So that way when we have less cards, it doesn't stretch them. But for normal page building, we would use autofit because we're okay with these items just kind of growing and shrinking to fill the space. Now here, when we have these 3 cards, what we'll notice is when it wraps, this card is just hanging out by its lonesome. So we might want them to all wrap at the same time. To do that, we can remove the auto fit settings and use a U grid above. This will keep a grid above our breakpoint, but then below the breakpoint, it'll make all the items wrap under each other. And above the breakpoint, we can set our column count to something like a 3-column grid, and then just let them stack under each other. Now, the point at which this wrap isn't tied to Webflow breakpoints. You'll notice even on tablet here, these are wrapping in between the tablet breakpoint. So we control that point from the actual container. So this is set to threshold medium. If I give the container a class of threshold large, then it's going to wrap somewhere up here. So here in the desktop breakpoint, it's switching from 3 columns to wrapping down here. If we go with threshold small, then it'll wait much longer before these wrap. So these cards are allowed to stay side by side for much, much longer, and then they'll eventually wrap somewhere down here. So that's how we can control where it wraps, and we can create some pretty unique layouts with this. So inside the grid, I might drop in this kind of content wrapper, and I've gone ahead and I'll give it, let's change this parent grid to be a 12-column grid again, and let's give this content wrapper a column width of 4, so it spans 4 of those 12 columns. And then let's go ahead and drop an image inside the grid. We'll give it a column width of 8. So it can span 8 of those 12 columns, and let's give it a height full so it fills all of that space. And then somewhere down here, they eventually wrap. This is getting very condensed because our threshold on the container is small. So let's switch that over to medium so that it's not quite so condensed. And that way, this is going to wrap somewhere around here. And when it does wrap, let's go ahead and add a gap also to our grid, a gap row of 8 to kind of space the image apart from the content like so. And so now we have this responsive layout that is also working with font size since it's not tied to Webflow breakpoints. So that's good to go there. Now, whenever this does wrap, we might want the image to be on top. So we can give the image an order of first, and that moves it above, but it also moves it before on desktop as well. So what we can do is we can unset the order. We can also unset the order either above the breakpoint or below the breakpoint. In this case, we want to remove it above the breakpoint. So the image goes back to its natural position, but then once things wrap, the image goes back on top. And we can also use this for different things. So like inside of this content wrapper, I have this div that holds the headings. And I might give this a padding block, which is top and bottom padding. Padding inline would be left and right, but we'll go with block here. And let's go ahead and give it a padding block of 6. So we have a little bit of space where the text isn't touching the top of the image. But then when it wraps, we get all this extra space we want to get rid of. So we can actually just give this an unset, and we'll unset all styles below the breakpoint. So it clears the padding and everything off this div below the breakpoint, but then above the breakpoint, it gets this extra padding. So we can also apply these grid classes to our custom classes. So I might use uGrid above here on this layout, and I could limit its column count here if we'd like. And in this case, we're going to head to this list element and we'll make it span 8 of the 12 columns. This is just applying some custom properties. So what we can actually do is apply this under here on the custom class if we'd like. So I can add a grid column start. And this allows us to say which column to start on. So if I say auto, it'll just start in its normal spot. If I say 6, this will make it start on the 6th column. And then we can also pass grid column end and say which column to end on. In this case, we can say span 5 additional columns from where you started, or we can say end on -1, which is the last column, or -2, which is the second to last column. And we can also combine this grid column start and end into one property by just passing in regular grid column. And then we can say start on the 6th column, end on -2. And this way we pass the start and the end into one. In this case, I'm going to make it start on auto, and for the end, I'll just make it span 8 like we want it originally. And that way it's spanning those columns there. Now on this list here, I have a couple items here, and I'm just going to go ahead and give this a uGrid auto fit. So that way it's just our auto fit kind of style here. And we can set our maximum column count like we talked about before. So just like we can do with the regular one. In this case, I'm going to go to that base class and I'll go ahead and change the row gap for when they wrap under each other to something like our space 8. So just like I can do this with the class, I can also do that with utilities by going gap row 8, and that would be the same way. But I typically like to not overstack utilities, limit it to mainly just one on top of the custom class. And that's mainly for things like grids or font size or things like that. So now that we have that set, we can also set the minimum column size on this. If we look at our grid column settings here, these are wrapping before the columns get smaller than 8 rem. So I could increase that to something like 14 if I want them to wrap a lot sooner. And that's where we can set that minimum column size for the auto fit. And that way we're using this all with a custom class. Now within this column, I have another auto fit grid, and I have the minimum column size large enough where they can't be side by side in this context. But as soon as this parent wraps, then now there's enough space for them to go side by side. And then once we run out of space, they'll just kind of go under each other again somewhere down here. So what we have is this entire layout is completely responsive from the desktop breakpoint. Just by increasing font size here, we're able to have a fully responsive layout. Now, if we open our variables and head to the default collection, we talked about the viewport max and min, which is where our fluid sizes stop scaling up and stop scaling down. We talked about our site margin, which controls the left and right space, keeping our container from touching the edge of the screen. The site gutter here is the space in between our columns here that controls the default gap for most of our grids. We can make that fluid if we want, but by default, it's just a static value. And then our site column count, this is the default column count our design was created in one. In most cases, 12 columns is going to be what you want, but if I update that to 10, notice it sets the 10 column grid here, and it sets that as the default for most of our grids when we switch that over like so. We also have our max width, which we talked about as the max width for a container. And by default, our main max width is just connected to the viewport max. So this is 90 times 1 rem. That becomes 90 rem for our max viewport width. And that just links our fluid font sizes stopping point to the container max width. So they stop scaling at the same point. We covered our max width full in case we need a container go to the edge of the screen. We have our border radius variables here. And we also have border width. We can add extra ones if we want a large border width or a thin one. And then for this focus here, this controls the thickness of the focus outline. And then its offset inner, we just want to take that same thickness and use a negative number. And for the offset outer, we can control how far we want that outer space to be. So by default, when we tab onto an element, it's going to be using offset outer. And that just keeps a little bit of a gap between the focus outline and the element in case the colors match like they do here. We want some separation between the two. But whenever we tab onto something like this, notice how the focus outline is being cropped because this link is inside an overflow hidden element there. So what we would want to do with these links then is for the offset of the focus outline, we would switch that over to offset inner. And that way, when we actually focus into this, the focus outline is going to be inside of that link instead of outside of it. So depending on where the link you're using is, you might want to switch between those focus variables. And then if we were to head back over here, underneath our focus, we have our coarse swatches, and you can add and remove however many of these as you'd like. Light 100 is going to be our brightest white there. And then maybe for this light 200, it could be kind of this off blue. And then I might duplicate that or create a new one, and we might have a light 300 depending on how many colors our design uses. So I might pull that up here, and then I might take that blue and just darken it a little bit. So the higher the number gets, the more dark it becomes. And then for this dark 800, we might go with kind of like this bluish greenish color here. And we might use a color like that. And then for the 900, it needs to be even darker. This is like our darkest color possible. And then we can also use these colors at opacities. So for this 900 opacity 20, I'm just taking the dark 900 and turning it down to 20% opacity. So I can use that for like border colors and different things there. Same for this light 100. I'm taking the light 100 and making an opacity 20 out of it. So we could do that with any of these different tints and shades. So for light 200, we can make opacity versions or any color we'd like. Now for these brands, we start by editing the brand 500 variable, and I can just switch that over to any color, and it makes all the tints and shades from that brand 500. It's just mixing this brand 500 with white, and for the darker versions, it's mixing it with black. And in this case, because this brand color is so dark, anytime we have text on top of it, we want to use white text. So anytime we have text on top of this brand color, we use white text. And for the brand text opacity 20, we'd just take that brand text and mix it with 20% opacity. If we have a secondary brand color, we can create a new color in here called brand secondary 500. And we can set that to be whatever our accent sort of brand color is. Of course, we'd want to create the tints and shades of that. And then we'd also want a text. So we'd call this brand secondary text. And once we have that set, we'd go ahead and just set what we want the text color to be when on top of this one. In this case, it's going to be a much darker color. So that's how we would set that there. We can control the navbar component with some of these default variables. If you're not using the Lumos navbar, you can just delete the entire grouping of all these nav component variables. And so if we were to head over to theme here, what we'll notice is inside of light mode, our section background color is this white color. And then we have a secondary background color we might use for cards or different things. And in this case, we're using this lightish blue color for our background too. And we could switch that around if we want it. Then we have the text color for this section that's using this color here when inside light mode. And then heading accent, if we were to bold a word inside of our heading, it's going to change to this brand color. So we can have a secondary text color as well for like a faded paragraph if we want, and any other text colors we want to add for each section. And then our border color, this is going to be that dark color at an opacity when inside light mode. Now, when we switch over to dark mode, the section background color becomes dark. Our secondary background color becomes a little bit lighter. And then the text color becomes white. And then like the border color becomes light at an opacity. And then when we switch to brand mode, we have our primary sort of brand color, our secondary background color. The text for this is going to be brand text, and the border color is going to be brand text at a lower opacity. And then we can style the selection color. So this is when we drag over text within each of the modes. So by default, this is this purple here. And if we want that to change depending on the mode we're in, like maybe inside of this brand mode, what we can do is we head over to the theme, and then inside of brand mode, we set the selection background color to be maybe light, and then the selection text color to be maybe dark like that. And that way, when we drag over text inside of here, it changes the selection color when inside the brand mode specifically. So we can control that selection color there. For the button, its background is purple here, its text is white, and then whenever we hover it, it becomes dark with a white text. So that is right here, it's purple, and we hover, it's hovering dark there. And then inside of dark mode here, it's going to be purple and it hovers white. So we can change any of that. So within this theme collection here, inside of dark mode for this primary button, it's purple here with light text. And maybe when we hover it, we switch it over to hover to this greenish color. And we would want to use the brand text that belongs with that greenish color. And the border can just stay connected to the background. So now when we hover this button inside of dark mode, we see the entire sort of state change. And for this outlines button, we can control what it should hover to, what its style should be inside each of the modes. So for instance, by default, this is the secondary button. It has a transparent background and its borders just connect it to the theme border. So it'll be whatever the border color is for the entire theme. But maybe inside of dark mode specifically, we want to change this border to be something more like, we'll go with our brand 500 color. And so now we've changed the border of that button to be this color when inside of dark mode. And we can make the entire button inside dark mode, this outline one, hover to have kind of this brand background color. And then we'd want its text color of the button to be brand text whenever we hover it. And now we've updated the hover state for this outline button inside of dark mode as well. And then we also have for our text link component, which I believe is down here, we have the text link right here. Its hover state for this underline inside of each of the different modes. So by default, this inside of dark mode, underline hovers to this brand color. So we can control all of that from the variables as well. If we go into theme, we have the text link, its default text color, and then its default border color. And then we hover it, what is its text and border change to on hover? So that's the basic different variables for the themes. And by default, we just have two button styles here. But what we could actually do is say we have a third button style. We would want to create a new variable here, new color variable, and we can call this like, we'll call this something like a button tertiary or button 3 sort of background. And then we just create those same variables for each instance inside of this. So I'd have the button border. So I'd create that under this button, which I believe is right up here. So we'll go ahead and create that right up here for button 3. We'll create a color variable to match this one. So it's border, and then we'll want to have its text, and then we'll want to have its background color on hover, background hover. We'll want to have its border hover, and we'll set that here. And we'll want to have its text hover, and then we'll set that here. And then once we define what that should be across each of the 3 different modes for that third button, we can head to our button style. And this just allows us to easily switch between those 3 modes without having to manually apply the different variables. So we would just create one more mode here for our third sort of button here. And then within that, we just connect it to the button 3's background, the button 3's border, button 3 text color here, and then the background hover for button 3, the border hover for button 3, and text hover for button 3. And now we have 3 different color themes within each of the different sections. And when we go to apply this, you will notice for the button here, it has basically its hover is set to like the button's background hover of that button style collection. Its border on hover changes to the border, and its text changes to the text hover. So it's not referencing like the primary or secondary or even button 3 variables directly. It's just referencing that button style collection. And that way we can easily switch the button style without having to go to replace the hover states and everything, just by switching this button style sort of mode. So by switching it to the third mode, for instance, we switch everything over. So I can just create a new variant on this button called third. And on that, I can go ahead and switch its style over to the third mode. And then all of its hovers and everything will be linked correctly without me having to redefine all of the hovers and everything across each of the 3 button modes. And that just speeds up the process significantly, especially when you're dealing with a lot of buttons that you need to switch the styles on. You can easily just apply those styles, especially if there's like icons inside each button that have a different color and things like that. You don't want to have to go manually change that out across each of the different button styles. So having a mode switcher for button style is extremely helpful. Then if we head back into our typography here, we have our primary font family. I can go ahead and change that to Montserrat, for instance, or Merriweather, and then it changes that font across everything throughout the whole site. It's all using this primary heading or primary font family style. And we also have the weights that we plan to use with that family. In this case, it's the 400, 500, 700. Now, if we have a secondary family under font family here, I can switch this over to secondary family. And I can go ahead and switch this to impact, for instance. And then I'd want to create a number variable here. We'll call this secondary regular. So we'll have that set there. And once we have that set, secondary regular, we'll go ahead and set the weight we want to use with this font. In this case, maybe 400. And that way, if we ever decide we want to use impact at a lighter weight, we just change its weight here, and it'll only affect where we're using the impact font. It won't affect the other font we're using there. So we can go ahead and have that set here. And one other thing you'll notice is we have the primary trim top and trim bottom variables. This just decides how much we're going to trim off of that heading in the text to make sure the bounding box basically hugs the content. So depending on the font you're using, it's going to need a different trim top and bottom depending on the family and use. What I like to do is I just add in a div so I can see this, and I set this top heading to something like the trim top. So text style trim top, and or actually let's switch it over to the trim top of the actual primary family. And then we'll set the trim bottom here to the primary family's trim bottom. And now if I edit this variable, I can kind of see what it's going to do in real time by using the Webflow UI. So that looks like it's aligning there for that. And then if I go ahead and edit the primary trim bottom, I might go ahead and reduce it a little bit more. Let's cut it in half. Let's go 3.6 or something like that. And that gets it to exactly hug the content for this family specifically. Now, when we do switch the heading, if I go back here, we already set up our secondary family. I might decide inside text style that all the H1s use that secondary family and the secondary weight, which we'll set here. And then instead of using the primary trim top and bottom, since this is a different font family, we'll need a trim top and bottom for that one. So we'll go ahead and create a size variable. We'll call this secondary, we'll call it trim top. And then we'll go ahead and create one for secondary trim bottom. And I'll go ahead and just plug in the values we're already using for this. So we'll copy it, paste it in here, copy and paste it in here. And then for that heading family there, we'll go ahead and select the H1 here and connect it to the secondary trim top and secondary trim bottom. And let's do the same thing for the H2. We'll connect it to the secondary family, secondary weight here, and connect it to secondary trim top and secondary trim bottom. So across the H1 and H2, they're using these styles. And then what we'll notice is that they have the correct styles, but because this is a different font, we're trimming a little too much off that. So we'll go ahead and go back to that div we created right here. And let's switch that over to the secondary trim top and secondary trim bottom. And that way we can just edit that variable here. So off the trim bottom, we need a little bit more. Let's edit that. And we'll increase it a little bit to make sure that this heading is hugging the actual bounding box. And that looks good for what we need there. So we can leave that set. And that's how we set up those trim variables there. Now also in our typography, if we want to add even more letter spacings, we can add those. If we want to add more line height variables, we can add those as well. Any more font sizes we can add to here. And then our text transforms are all here as well. So within the text style, this is where we set the font sizes, like the H2 is referencing that H2 font size. It's referencing kind of this small line height. It's referencing this tight letter spacing. We can set it to be all caps if we want it. We do uppercase. We can set its margin top and bottom, its font families, its trims, and also its text wrap. On the paragraphs, we usually want text wrap pretty. So this is usually what you want for paragraphs. It just makes sure that there's never just one word on the last line. And then for headings, we usually want text wrap balance, but we can control that default text wrap across all of those styles. Now in spacing, we have our different spacing variables. This is for spacing apart elements within a section. So this is used on like headings and the buttons, groups, top margin, all of that. And we can use the spacing scale here. And then we have the actual section spacings. These are larger so that elements, if we use one of these and space apart an element, it won't look like it's in two separate sections because this value is still smaller than any of our section spacings. So we can control those all from the Fluid Builder, but these are where our spacings are stored. In our alignment, this is just where we switch our alignment modes for text and flex alignment. Our column count, this is where we switch our different column counts for all of our grids. And then for our gaps, this is where we can switch out our gaps here. And this is mainly just for like the auto fit grid, just to make sure that the gap stays in sync. So that is our main variables there. Now we also have alignment utilities of justify content and align items. And when you're unsure of when to use each one, so for align items here, we're dealing with how each item is going to align. So we couldn't take this one item and say align it to the end because it would just run into this other content. So align items in this case, because it's in a horizontal flex, deals with moving this item up and down. So if I do align items on this parent flex and I say end, it pushes them all to the bottom. Now, in this case, if I do justify content and I say end, we're talking about taking this grouping of content and moving it over to the end. Now, whenever the flex direction is vertical, items are stacking under each other, it's going to do the opposite. So align items doesn't move elements up and down anymore because you can't take this one item and move it up. It would run into the button above it. So what we'd do instead is we would actually justify content. This is the whole grouping of content that we would move up to the start in this case. So justify content is now moving elements up and down, whereas align items would move individual items side to side, doing the opposite of what we'd have here. Now, even though we have this align items in and it's pushing each of these items to the end, on an individual item, we can do align self. So on a child, and we can say align it to the start. So it overrides what its parent told it to do, or we can do stretch and then it'll stretch out and fill. So we can also align individual items, but on the actual grid or flex box, we do align items and justify content. So to see this all in practice here, let's go ahead and remove some of these classes, and let's go ahead and just add an image into our grid. So what we'll notice here is, if we go to maybe a larger screen size, is that this content block is centered within the parent, and that's because the content wrapper has a line self-center by default. So it just centers it, whereas if that was off, it would just stretch. Now, if we go up to the whole grid, in this case, we want to align items. So we could do align item center, and that would make sure that this text box is centered with the image. And then on shorter screens where the text is larger, this image is centered with the text, because we're aligning all items to center within this grid. I'm going to take that off though, because I actually don't want that. We only want to align the content block to center. So I'll do align self center in this case, and we'll leave the image stretching, and we just need to make sure we give it height full so it can fill that stretch. But what that allows us to do is make sure that the image is always as tall as the text at least. But if the image is taller, then that content blocks will just center itself within that parent. Inside our container, let's drop in our video component here, and this is just a looping video. We need the direct link to the video file, so it can't be like a YouTube link. It could be like Vimeo Pro or AWS or something that gives you direct links to the file. Now, before the videos load it, we get this background color here showing that something's going to load in, and that's coming from this U background skeleton class, so just by applying that class there. Now for this video here, I'm going to give it a cover absolute. So it's position absolute 100% within height. And then because it's inside the container, I'm going to need to give it z-index negative. So it's underneath all the content. And then I'll go ahead and drop in an overlay component. And this allows me to choose my darkening opacity here. And then that's absolute with the negative z-index as well. And then I could grab an image if I want a background image, and I could set that to the same cover absolute with the same z-index negative, so that it goes underneath everything. And I would put that behind the overlay and potentially behind the video as well. So before the video loads in, we would just see the image under that. So that's how we can set up our background elements. Now we also have inside of this button here and any of our elements, we have this clickable component. So even if we were to build a simple card, for accessibility, we wouldn't want to turn the whole card into a link, because then the screen readers have to read way too much content. So we just add in a clickable element inside of that card. And this clickable component, it's just a position absolute link that covers the whole parent. And there's a link block and also an HTML button tag inside. So it'll automatically use the right one. So basically, if this link is set to go to a page or something, then it'll show the link. But if this isn't set, it'll use the HTML button tag. So this can like open a modal or do some kind of action on the current page. Now, if we were to open this up inside both the link and button, there's some text with a class of screen reader only. So this is just some hidden text that the screen reader will read when focused on the button or link. And we apply that text here. So I might say read the story or whatever I want this card to say when the user focuses on that link. Now for the type here, it's set to button by default, but if this is used inside of a form, I could switch it to submit so that clicking on this link would submit the form, or reset so that clicking on the link would clear out all of the fields. And I can also add for target _ blank so it opens in a new tab. This is helpful when this link is connected to a CMS field and we lose the open in controls. So here we are able to just set the target in here from there. Now that's all for our clickable component. Now I also want to show what happens when we have an icon. So if I were to copy this icon as SVG, and then from Figma, we talked about using the SVG import app at the start of this. So let me go ahead and click in this box and paste to bring in that SVG. Now inside of this SVG, it's a path and it has a stroke width. So here we have basically a stroke path component. And from there, under settings, we would copy the path settings on this path and then just delete the path and paste it into here. And then we would do the same thing, duplicate the path, copy the path settings here, and then we can delete this path and then just paste it in here. And so this path is connected to our border width variable, and it has a vector effect non-scaling stroke to make sure everything's sized correctly. So for any outline SVGs, we want to use that stroke path component. On all our SVGs, we want to add U-SVG, And this removes the default bottom spacing and it gives us all the correct styles. And then we just turn this into a component. I can call this icon arrow out. And I can go ahead and put it in my SVG group and create, so that whenever I search for icon, I see all my different icons. If I search for icon arrow, I see the different arrow icons. And then we would set the font color and the width and everything from a parent div. That way the same icon can be used at multiple different sizes and styles. So that's how we create our icon component. Lastly, we have our starter CSS component. And so anytime we want to store CSS in a component, we can unlink this and just write our CSS that belongs to a specific section. And then same thing for our starter JS. We can drop in this component, unlink it, and then add any JS that belongs to a specific component. So that's an overview of the components, variables, and classes in Lumos. I hope that this lesson helps you get started in using Lumos for your projects.